So if you've been with us over the last number of weeks, you know we're in this section in the Gospel of John, John 14 through John 17, where Jesus is really talking to his disciples, and this whole section is going to finish with a prayer that appears to be some kind of public prayer that Jesus is making. And he's telling them that he's going to go away and they can't come with him. Remember, so that's the whole context of this section. Jesus is letting them know the crucifixion and the resurrection, the ascension is coming. They don't know any of that exactly, just that he's going away and they can't come. And it's frustrating for them. They're wrestling through this. And Jesus is telling them that it's okay because they know the way to where he's going. And of course, by way, he's talking specifically about a path towards God that's going to be made available by Jesus on the cross and his resurrection when he defeats sin and death. But he's also talking about his way, the way that Jesus has shown of being human in perfect intimacy with God that's going to be now available to us as well. So Jesus is saying, listen, the way that you exist in this crazy in-between time, disciples, where I'm not physically present, but you are, and remember, we've said this is extraordinarily relevant to us because we also live in a crazy in-between time where Jesus is not physically present with us on earth, but here we are, and so we're functioning in that same sort of way. He said the way that you have full life, that you live as you're meant to, is that you have intimacy with the Father, intimacy with God. And of course, this is made available by Jesus. And then last week we talked about that dirty little four-letter word for many Christians, right? O-B-E-Y, right? Your parents taught you about all kinds of different bad words, but obey for many of us is a four-letter word, isn't it? But we understood that it's not really that God is saying, hey, you better do these things or else, but God is actually inviting us into a whole other way of living that actually enables us to maintain intimacy with him and experience the full life that comes with it. There is no intimacy without obedience, and there is no obedience without intimacy. They're inextricably bound to each other. Now this morning, as we talk about it, Jesus is going to let them know, oh, by the way, in this world, you're going to encounter a lot of trouble. All right? So now what he's saying is obedience and intimacy are key to each other, and here's why they're really important. Because it's not going to be smooth sailing in this world. And the way that you have the experience of full life, even in the midst of trouble, is through intimacy with God, and obedience is part of that. Does this make sense? So, if you have a copy of the scriptures, you can turn to John chapter 15. You'll notice that we're going to skip. It's not because we don't like the very beginning of John chapter 15. It's because I'll let you guys in on a little secret this morning. 2 weeks from today, Pastor Jake is going to preach here at Bethlehem. And he's going, yeah. Sorry, Jake, if I'm putting you on the spot. And he's going to preach on the first half of John 15, okay? And so I don't want to steal any of his thunder, and so just know that it's all part of this, okay? All right, John 15, verse 17, we'll read to the end of John 15. Jesus says, listen, if the world hates you, keep in mind that it hated me first. If you belong to the world, it would love you as its own. As it is, you do not belong to the world, but I have chosen you out of the world. That is why the world hates you. Remember what I told you. A servant is not greater than his master. If they persecuted me, they will persecute you also. If they obeyed my teaching, they will obey yours also. They will treat you this way because of my name, for they do not know the one who sent me. If I had not come and spoken to them, they would not be guilty of sin. But now they have no excuse for their sin. Whoever hates me hates my Father as well. If I had not done among them the works no one else did, they would not be guilty of sin. As it is, they have seen, and yet they have hated both me and my Father. But this is to fulfill what is written in their law. They hated me without reason. Of course, that quotation comes from one of two Psalms that were both written by King David. When the advocate comes, whom I will send to you from the Father, the Spirit of truth who goes out from the Father, he will testify about me. And you also must testify, for you have been with me from the beginning. Word of God for the people of God. So, some strong language in this text, isn't it? I mean, it doesn't take a Bible scholar to help anyone realize that the word hate shows up about 1 billion times. And that's really uncomfortable, right? One, because we're being told we will be hated. No one likes that. And two, wait, isn't this whole Bible message about love and good things and grace? And why is Jesus all of a sudden using this word hate all the time? So we kind of have to make sense of this and rightly situate this. And I want to kind of give you a thesis statement at the beginning to kind of help you track as we go along. And that is, excuse me, that in this world, if you follow the way of Jesus, you will have resistance. Guaranteed. What and how that resistance looks like is wildly varied. In the country that we live in and the time that we live in is very different than the first century world of Jesus and the disciples he were launching out into. Most of them are going to die for their faith. That is not a sermon that I can preach to you in this culture, in this moment. And so there is differences. And I think sometimes, hear me correctly, church, Christians get obsessed with this idea that, oh, the world hates us, and so we got to fight. And that's a misunderstanding of what's going on here. Instead, Jesus just wants to be honest with us that when you live a different way, it's going to rub a lot of people the wrong way. Does that make sense? And then when we get to the end, we're going to consider, okay, what is our responsibility then in living in that kind of world? So, two big questions. One, how will the world respond to true disciples? Question one, right? Question two, how do true disciples respond to the world? Make sense? This is what we're after this morning, so let's kind of get into it together. How will the world respond to true disciples? Well, it said it in that first verse right there. It says, right? If the world hates you. Let's just take that little clause and try to understand every single word in it, because it's the introductory clause that makes sense of all of this. Let's start with the word world, because for us, that could mean a bunch of different things, right? It is the Greek word cosmos, and many times when it's spoken, it is meant to mean the entire created world. So, for instance, John 3:16, which many of us are familiar with. For God so loved the world, the cosmos, that he gave his only son. So he's talking about the whole created world there, right? But sometimes when John uses the word world in his gospel and in his letters, 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, as well as sometimes when Jesus is using it, he's talking about a subsection of the created world, specifically the part of the created world that lives in rebellion against God. Does this make sense? So there is cosmos that means whole world, and then there is cosmos that means unredeemed world. Does that make sense? Unrestored world, ungospeled world, untransformed part of the world. This is why, for John in his letters, also the letter of James that we studied a couple of years ago, oftentimes the New Testament writers will refer to the three enemies of the church. You heard this before? And some of the early church fathers and stuff kind of wove these together. But the three enemies of the church, as it were, would be first, our flesh, right? That part of us that, again, the Greek word sarx, sometimes it means like physical body, sometimes it means the part of us that is still rebelling against God, the part of us that's not yet fully redeemed or restored. So the flesh, the second, the world, the part of the world that is not yet fully restored, and then the devil, but speaking of the angelic realm that is not yet restored or redeemed and won't be restored or redeemed. Does this make sense? So oftentimes the New Testament will talk about that, the world, the flesh, and the devil. And so right here then, Jesus is talking about the world. So that means he's not talking about you. He's not talking about your flesh. It also means he's not talking about the spiritual world. Does it make sense? The devil, the demonic world that is unredeemed. He's talking about the part of the created existing world that remains unredeemed and unrestored. That is, that people, places, structures, systems of this world that are unbelieving and unredeemed. That in our interactions with them, it can be difficult. All right, so world. The second word that is in there is the word hate. Let's make sense of this word for just a second. And I wish I could tell you that, hate is a strong translation, but it's the Greek word miseo, and hate is a perfect translation. It's what it means. You could also translate despise, right? You could translate it as heavily resistant to, this kind of language. Again, what we need to understand, though, is it is a disposition, right? It is not necessarily an action. Does that make sense? And so it's a disposition towards something that may or may not be overtly understood by a person, place, or thing, but is moving in the background. And therefore, the experience of hate can be any number of things, can it? It can be loud and big and public. It can also be small, and minuscule, and private. It can be a public resisting. It can also be a private dismissal. Does this make sense? All of these are fueled by the same thing. So we can't look at this word and think, he's talking about when I go out and I proclaim the gospel in word to someone and they sort of chew me out for even doing that. Would that be a response of hate? Sure. But it's also when you choose to live a different way, no one ever says anything to you, but they make a judgment of you in their mind and dismiss you privately. Does this make sense? It's a disposition. It's a massive spectrum, some of which we will encounter in public ways, some of which we may never tangibly encounter, or we may perceive is happening, but someone may not be fully honest with us, right? This is what we're talking about. Third word in that clause, which is super important, is the word if. Why would he use that word? If is a necessarily conditional word, right? If, then. But using the word if means it might not happen. So what makes this conditional? If the world hates you, what would make it conditional? Well, if we read it in the context of the passage we've just said, the only conditionality is not so much will this resistance happen to you, but will you live the way of Jesus? Does that make sense? The if is not, well, sometimes you live the way of Jesus and you don't experience any resistance. The if is, sometimes you don't live the way of Jesus and you don't experience some level of resistance. Does it make sense? That's what we're talking about here. If the world hates you, last word we want to talk about is the word you. Because we are Western Americans, we read pronouns like this and we just blindly assume they are singular, don't we? Oh, he's talking about me. But the word you in the New Testament, and in the Old Testament for that matter, is almost universally plural, not singular. And therefore, we should always be processing statements like this in the collective, not in the individual. Does that make sense? In the same way, when they're talking about faith, we ought to think about faith in that way too. So Jesus is instructing his disciples to understand resistance or difficulty or friction or trouble in this world necessarily communally. Does that make sense? And that's important Because Jesus is reminding them, first and foremost, the issue really isn't you. The issue is what you're holding allegiance to. Does that make sense? The issue isn't you in particular, it's the Jesus that you are aligning your life with. Beyond that, and we kind of get hints into this later on, though Jesus doesn't directly say it, but the biggest hint I can remember is, you remember a couple of weeks ago when we were talked about Peter being restored and redeemed by Jesus, and Peter, remember, he looks over at John, who's eavesdropping on the conversation, and Jesus has just told Peter, you're going to die for your faith. And Peter looks over at John and is like, well, what about him? And Jesus goes, you let me worry about him. Right? In other words, resistance is going to be different. It's meant to be understood collectively. And therefore, we are meant to band together in such a way that we are supporting one another in our faith for the proclamation of the gospel in this world. Does that make sense? That we need each other in the collective you, so that in the individual you, we can live the way of Jesus in a world that is regularly rubbed the wrong way by it. Make sense? And that while this at some level it's a bit of an easier sermon for me to preach, because on Monday morning I'm going home to work in the local church. And you're going home to work in places of secular business, and I praise God for that. But I need to be connected to what you're doing, and you need to be connected to what I'm doing, so that we're constantly building each other up, so that the places that God sends us is always going to be different experiences, and at some level there's going to be different resistances, and we need the support of each other in order to make this thing work. Make sense? If the world hates you, kind of sets us up to understand this whole thing. So what I want to do is take a little bit of time then and ask the question, well, why? Why would the world hate? After all, everything Jesus is talking about seems like something the world ought to love, right? Serving one another, turning the other cheek, sacrificially giving the other, caring for the poor, all of these things. Well, there's a core part of the message of Jesus that rubs people the wrong way, and that is that we are broken human beings. And what we'll find out is no one really likes grappling with that truth. You and me, usually included, right? This is why Paul writes later to the Corinthians, and we'll reference this in a little bit later, but that the gospel is foolishness to those who are perishing, but to those who are being rescued, it is the very power of God, right? I mean, wildly different views about the same reality. So, where does hate come from? Where does resistance, where does pushback come from? Oh, and before I get there, let me pause and say, because this word was used by Jesus in the context, so we should probably define it and make sense of it. Jesus says, if they persecuted me, they will persecute you. Okay? What does the word persecute mean? We need to understand that again. We can't get away from the fact that it means physical resistance to the gospel, because the Apostle Paul, you remember when he is an opponent of the church, speaks of himself as a persecutor. And what was he doing? He was physically harming people, right? So at one level, persecution is a physical resistance. But if we put it on the spectrum of hate, as I've talked about before, it can come in all shapes and sizes. And so at the very core of the word, it talks about either pursuing or pushing away, right? Persecution happens either in a pursuing of someone or in a pushing them away. Both of them are moved by utter dismissal. Make sense? Okay. So, 3 reasons I think Jesus gives us in this section of why there can be resistance in this world to living the way of Jesus. Here's the first thing. Jesus says, listen, they're going to, his words, hate you because you don't belong to them, right? You don't belong to them. I have chosen you out of the world. What Jesus is saying, you belong to me now. You don't belong to them, and that's going to rub the world the wrong way. What does that mean? Weird thing to say, isn't it? Well, I think at the core, what Jesus means by this, he's talking about allegiance. In other words, where do your loyalties ultimately lie? And this is what's going to frustrate the world sometimes. Because listen, much of what Jesus calls his church to be is going to be an incredible blessing to this world. But if you are completely loyal and your allegiance is fully with Jesus, listen to me and wrestle with this. It seems to me you can never be fully in alignment with anything in this world. At some level, there's going to be a break. Maybe it's 90%, but that last 10%, maybe it's even more than that, or maybe there's very little alignment. But when that lack of alignment comes, when you're forced to choose which side am I going to be on in this situation, when you choose allegiance with Jesus, there's going to be friction with those who aren't. Make sense? So think about this with me for just a minute. And I'm not giving these examples to poke anyone, okay? I'm not. So if you feel particularly challenged by something that's either the Holy Spirit or, internal wrestle or something else, but I'm not trying to poke anyone in particular. But some of these are hot button issues, right? So let's talk about politics, okay? Again, we're not a political church. We don't tell you who to vote for. We have different political parties represented in this church. I'm grateful for that. I think that's good. I think we should all be very thoughtful in our politics. But here's what I need you to know. No political party is in complete alignment with Jesus. So be careful. Don't just say, well, I just vote Democrat. Well, I just vote Republican, right? I grew up in a church that said, you just vote Republican, man. Okay, but wait a minute. That we're telling each other not to think about that. We're telling ourselves to fully align with something as opposed to saying, no, I'm going to try to align myself perfectly in the way of Jesus, and therefore I will vote on the basis of that allegiance, not a party allegiance. Make sense? But when you do that, and you have to confront something in your personal political party, you're going to find some resistance, aren't you? Like, I'm with you 80% over here, Democrat Party or Republican Party, but this other stuff, I can't get with this. And every once in a while you'll see a politician do that, and guess what happens? They're suddenly out of a job, The world doesn't like that stuff. The world wants you to align with them. You can do the Jesus thing so much as it aligns with them. Does that make sense? But when you do the Jesus thing and you're aligned with him, they only like it so much as it aligns with what they're doing. Politics, right? Let's do another thing. And again, I need to preface this. I love this country. I'm so grateful to be born here. But if you are profess blind allegiance to the United States of America, that's a recipe for disaster, isn't it? I mean, if the country is in a perfect alignment with Jesus and you're aligned with it, that's wonderful. But what happens when it's not? What are you going to do? Right? Well, we grew up in this country pledging allegiance to the flag. I'm not telling you shouldn't do that. I'm not saying anything about patriotism or any of that stuff. I'm just simply saying to you, great to be an American, but you better be a Christian who's an American, not an American who's a Christian. Does that make sense? And when we get those mixed up, we're going to rub, or when we get them correct, we're going to rub some people the wrong way. Does it make sense? And we have to wrestle with that. We can't just, part of what Jesus is saying here, you can't just go with the flow. Because you're going to step out of my way when you're just trying to just be what everyone else wants you to be. Let's get a little more personal for a minute. Let's talk about your place of business. Right? Your place of business wants you to be have perfect allegiance to them, do they not? They want you to do things the way they want you to do it. They want you to treat customers the way they want you to do it. They want you to hit your goals the way they want you to hit your goals, or whatever it is. Listen, this is really hard because they're paying your paycheck and your bills, but you have to be someone who has full allegiance to Jesus who is also working in your particular place of employment. Does that make sense? And sometimes, it means going to your boss and being like, again, there's two different ways to do this. I don't want to get to the end before, but let me do it this way, right? You don't go to your boss and say, I'm a Christian. We don't do stuff like that. That's nonsense. You go to your boss and say, hey, I've been thinking about this. I've been wrestling with this. This is hard for me. This is challenging for me. Are there other ways? Can we dialogue together about different ways? You approach them and engage them in those ways. But you stand for the values that you have because your allegiance is to Jesus, not to your company, right? At the end of the day, full life comes from intimacy with God, not the 50-year employment gold watch. Yeah? This is what we believe, isn't it? So sometimes that means when I was in seminary, I worked at a bank. And, banks are dangerous places to work for because they're selling things. You think they're just holding your money, but they're selling things left and right. And they are preying, I'm speaking collectively, I shouldn't. Bank I was working at and many others are preying on people who are less fortunate because their overdraft fees are helping to pay my salary as a customer service representative at the bank. And what do the banks want you to do? Not get things right, but help them open more accounts so they can have more fees. And it forced me to have to go to my boss and be like, hey, there's got to be another way. There's got to be other people who we can offer services to that can actually do this. And it made me, having built a good enough relationship with my boss, be able to say, I in good conscience can't do this. I'll call people, I'll sell things, but this is the group. And we came to an agreement, thank goodness. But at some level, we have to process these things, don't we? Like our allegiance is to Jesus, who tells us to care for the less fortunate. Not to, I can name the bank because they don't exist anymore. Not to Commerce Bank, right? We have to wrestle with these things. Oh, by the way, so too for your colleagues at your place of business, right? Thank goodness for our colleagues. Many of them are wonderful friends of ours, and that's really important and significant. But man, work culture is something, isn't it? I mean, I don't know what it is about American work culture, but no one is happy, right? I haven't done full studies on that, but I talk to everyone, and everyone's like, well, I like my job, but, And I get it, because I've worked in these jobs too. Now, my current job is going pretty well, thanks. So, but what does it mean to have allegiance to Jesus in some of those difficult co-worker relationships where people are bashing other people, where people are ganging up against other people, where people are bad-mouthing bosses and speaking of them in certain ways? Like you can be the nicest person, you can have fun, you can go out on Friday nights with your colleagues, build relationships, but if you're the person who doesn't join in on the text thread, sometimes that gets noticed, doesn't it? And it might not be an overt confrontation of hate, but sometimes it can be a dismissal. Oh, she's not like us, is she? These are challenging things. And Jesus wants us to be invested and involved in these relationships, so we've got to navigate them. And I've kind of made my point, but last illustration, I'll do it really quick. And then just everyday relationships, right? They go swimmingly until you find that point of lack of intersection, where you're like, well, I do this because this is how I've understood the impact of the gospel and how I'm meant to live, and that person's like, well, that makes no sense to me. Why on earth would you even do something like that? And it can be painful and damaging and whatever to relationships. But at the end of the day, is your goal to sustain, to sustain a relationship at all costs, or to walk in the way of Jesus and believe that part of that is going to sustain relationships for his glory? Does it make sense? Again, none of that was to poke anyone in a particular way. I'm just trying to show you the universal nature of what I'm talking about. We could spend the next 2 years giving examples of how all of this plays out in various sections of our lives. But at the end of the day, what we say is, when you walk in the way of Jesus and it's not in alignment or allegiance with other people, expect to feel a little friction. Sometimes loud in public, sometimes quiet and dismissing. It all comes from the same place. The second reason that hate or dismissal or persecution might come your way is, and maybe this should be obvious to us, but sometimes we forget this. Jesus says, listen, they hate you because they hate me, and they hate me because they don't know the one who sent me. Right? What is he saying? They don't know God. Now, fascinatingly here, we've talked about this a couple different times if you've been with us. There's two different Greek words for know. Remember this? You're like, I've heard this a million times, Adam. Right? Gnosko, relational knowing. You know because you're close, intimate, in proximity, in relationship. It's transforming. Oida, know facts about. Guess what word this is? This is oida. He's saying not only do they not have a relationship with God, they don't even know anything about him. They know nothing about him. In essence, you could say they've never met him, right? He's not even an acquaintance. Their picture of who God is radically different than who God actually is. And they have no idea why he would send Jesus. So there's two parts to this, right? The first part, Christians, and listen to me, is you should not expect non-Christians to behave like Christians. Why do we do that? All the time we're like, well, I can't believe they did that. Sure you can. They don't know God, you know? We can't believe they did it because it was hurtful to us. Now, that's real and that's pain, and we should process that together in intimacy with God. I don't mean to dismiss that at all. But then it should also break your heart, right? This is the same Jesus who gets killed by people in Jerusalem who weeps over Jerusalem, right? Like the resistance we should feel, in so much as it is personally painful, should also bring us to some serious levels of biblical lamentation. Shouldn't it? Like, man, this is not the world God created it to be. And if this person only got a true vision of who God was, we still might not align, but at least we'd have some level of common ground. And then the last thing, Jesus says, hey, and listen, oh, by the way, another big part of the friction is that because I came, people have been exposed to their personal guilt, right? In other words, because of Jesus' teaching of the gospel, which was universally to religious, moral people and wildly secular people, that you are equally broken, and apart from my work of salvation, you cannot be in right relationship with God. That was deeply offensive, largely to the religious people, right? Who thought they had earned a status because of morality or religious performance or whatever it might be. That's why Jesus, interestingly, said in talking about persecution and hate, he said, this comes to fulfill their law. Ooh, ugh. He's equating the Pharisees with the world. Them's fighting words, isn't it? Amazing. And yet so it is of everyone. At the core of resistance to the way of Jesus and the message of Jesus is no one wants to deal with the guilt of their personal brokenness. And while in many ways a publicly proclaimed gospel obviously elicits that, so too, listen to me, and perhaps even more powerfully, does a gospel-informed life demonstrate that to people around you. Because they're asking, why are they doing that? Oh, I should do that too, but I don't. Does it make sense? And so when we live a different way, it is faith exemplified, it is gospel exemplified, and it cuts people to the core because they know in it is a message of repentance that no one wants to grapple with. Make sense? Cool. So listen, in this world, you experience some level of resistance. Public, private, small, big, dismissals, pursuits, different seasons, different things. This is not a message that says, you charge into the world and preach the gospel and people are going to punch you and slap you and whatever. I mean, that could happen, but It's different. It's more nuanced than that. Does that make sense? So really the important question then, how do true disciples, how do people who are living the way of Jesus respond to the world? Did you hear what Jesus' words were at the end of this whole section? You must testify to the world. We don't like it when Jesus uses words like that, do we? Must. Ooh, sounds like one of those obedience words. Not like, hey, think really hard about this. Find a certain way to do it. Jesus is giving us no optionalities. This is full-on conscription. If you're living my way, part of my way means you will live as a testimony in this world. Right? Again, this is word and deed. This isn't, hey, you got to go into the middle of this and just sort of preach in the middle of this and whatever. No, you need to be ready, as the New Testament writers say, to speak to the faith that you have. But a huge part of it is living the way of Jesus in the midst of a resistant world. In essence, Jesus said, hey, this is going to be challenging, but you got to do it. So we're like, what does that mean? Well, to testify means to bear witness, right? It comes from the Greek word martyreo. And if you're in tune with that, you're like, oh, is that where we get our English word martyr from? Yes, it is. You're saying, well, you said I didn't have to die for my faith. Aren't martyrs people who died for their faith? Yeah. But the word comes from people who exemplified their faith by their allegiance to Jesus. It does not mean that you have to necessarily be put to death for your faith. Someone who testifies is someone who lives in allegiance to Jesus in a world that is demanding your allegiance to them. How do you do it? Well, before Jesus says you must testify, he said, I'm sending to you the advocate who will testify. You must, he will. Now, we have to put this in context again to remember this really well. Remember that Jesus has already told us that the Spirit is coming only for believers, not for the world. So this testifying then, when we get to the talking about the Holy Spirit in chapter 16, it'll be a little different. We're talking about testifying to the world. But this testifying here then has to be to the church. In essence, the Spirit is testifying to you so you can testify to the world. Does that make sense? And again, leading you into obedience, showing you the way of Jesus, sometimes giving you the words to say in a moment. The advocate that is pointing you in the right direction towards the way of Jesus. What an incredible gift from God. That, friends, is his presence in the midst of our enemies. The means of a feast amongst our enemies. The person of peace. And what does it look like to testify in this world? Well, I can't give you specific examples because that would take forever. But I can give you one word to speak of the character of being a witness in this world. And that's the word love. It was paramount through this whole section. Jesus is constantly, he's using the word hate a lot right now, but he's constantly telling the disciples, they'll hate you, you love them. Right? We don't fight like the world fights. Somehow in the Christian world over the last 20 years, and COVID really ramped it up, and political divisiveness ramped it up, we started fighting like the world fights, didn't we? We're out there picking fights and yelling at people and screaming and condemning people instead of coming alongside them, living a totally different life in allegiance to Jesus and speaking truth when and where we need to speak truth on the basis of that. I'm all for all of that. But we can't do it like the world does it. We have to do it like Jesus did it, because we're talking about the way of Jesus. That is, if your bearing witness is not characterized by love, then it is not bearing witness. And it is therefore not the way of Jesus. I'm not saying that there won't be times you have to say hard things, true things to people. But I am saying Everything you do and the whole disposition of your life has to be characterized by love. A self-sacrificing love that laments over the world instead of is out there seeking to condemn them. Remember, Jesus said, I did not come to condemn the world, but to offer rescue and salvation. It doesn't mean that there isn't condemnation. It just means it's not yours and mine to give. And it wasn't Jesus's to give in his first incarnation. We are agents of the gospel, friends. How bizarre that sometimes we can speak the truth of the gospel in a way that looks nothing like the gospel. You're saying, but it's hard. You're darn right? Or as my mom would say, you're darn tootin', right? It's super hard, and it's really nuanced. And we get it wrong, and thank goodness for the grace of God, which we fall back on, right? The way of Jesus is before us. Jesus ends John chapter 16, verse 33 by saying, friends, in this world you will have trouble. He does not tell us specifically what that trouble might look like, nor does he say individually what it will be. But he says, take hope, for I have overcome the world. This means a couple things to us, doesn't it? One, this is fairly super simple, but fair, right? One, you're on the winning team, right? Even if at times it looks like things are going the other way. Jesus is prevailing and will prevail. It also means, two, he's going to do it. You don't have to win it. He will win it. It is not your job to convince, though you ought to be winsome and persuasive in how you live. He does that. He overcomes the world. We testify to the world of the overcomer who gives full life. It seems to me that truth like that allows us to sit down, even in the midst of our enemies, and enjoy a feast with our God. And at some level, friends, that feast is necessitated by Jesus himself. And not necessitated, but made possible by Jesus himself. And at some level, that feast is Jesus himself, who calls his disciples, strangely, to feast on his body and blood. The gospel as nourishment. You pray with me? Jesus, two tough words. We don't like obey and we don't like trouble. It seems to me we've misunderstood both of them. That's why we don't like them. Well, I probably shouldn't like trouble. We've misunderstood that obedience is actually an invitation into a better way of living that gives us full life. And we've processed trouble without fully understanding your full and utter presence with us in the midst of it. Thank you, Jesus, that you have not sent us into the world empty-handed, but you've given us your Spirit as an advocate. Therefore, your very presence with us, that as the psalmist writes in Psalm 23, even in the valley of the shadow of death, we don't have to fear because you are with us. Your presence changes everything. Might we be increasingly people who walk in the way of Jesus, even in the midst of resistance, I pray. In your name, amen.